Hello, and welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, Unpacking the Science of Reading Defining Guide. My name is Nicole Kotko, and I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Pam Kastner, our state lead for literacy. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping items to review. You can access the presenter handouts for this session, the presenter bio, and the conference schedule on the patent website, and the link will be provided in the chat. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which includes a 15-minute question and answer period. To access closed captioning, please click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technology difficulties, please go to the technical support guides area above the schedule on the symposium page. Please note your microphones have been muted and your video feature has been turned off. We would love for you to tweet out and share on social media all that you are learning during the Literacy Symposium. The hashtag for the symposium is hashtag patent, P-A-T-T-A-N, lit, L-I-T, 2022, and it has been posted in the chat by Pam. And now we would like to introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Stuller. Stephanie?
Thanks so much, Nicole, and thank you, Pam. Thanks to all the folks at Patent who have worked for many months behind the scenes to make this literacy symposium possible. Thank you for including me in this fantastic learning opportunity. And thanks to everyone who is participating in this session. I hope that this information will be valuable to helping you improve the reading outcomes for your students. That is always our goal. So the topic today is Unpacking the Science of Reading, a Defining Guide. This is a document, this is a tool that I am going to walk you through and hopefully give you some direction about how the information in this defining guide might help you to focus your instruction so that you can improve reading outcomes for your students. So my objectives today are to explore the definition of the science of reading that's included in the defining guide. We'll talk about how that definition can support the work that you're doing with students and maybe the ways that you can use this guide in the future. I would definitely want you to be thinking about that. I'm going to ask you to commit to that at the end of the session. So if you are working in a classroom, really if you're working in schools in general, you have to make thousands of decisions every day, thousands of decisions related to making choices to do this or that with your students, to go one way or another. And there are a variety of things that guide you. You're guided by your beliefs about what you think, especially related to reading, how reading develops, what you believe about the best way to teach reading. You are guided by what has worked for you in the past, your own experience, what you observe others doing. That's very powerful in schools, to be able to watch other people who are perhaps getting good outcomes with their students, observe and imitate what they're doing. You are, if you're compliant, doing what you're told to do. That guides your decision making, whether that's what you've directly been told to do by a supervisor, for example, or what you're listening to others what they are doing and what they are suggesting that you do. You're guided by what you like or prefer. So our preferences also inform the decisions, the choices that we make about our actions in classrooms. And I want to make sure research is somewhere on this list. So I want to make sure that as you are making choices and decisions in the classroom, that you are aware of how research can inform those decisions and choices, and that that is at least a factor in the movements that you're making for your students in the classroom. So this is really the idea behind the Science of Reading Defining Guide. This is a cover on the screen of that published version of the defining guide. There's also a free PDF version. I'm going to hold up my copy so you see what it looks like. You can purchase this from the Reading League's website. And what I'm going to do today is literally go through almost page by page and show you what is in the guide, talk about how I think the contents of this guide can be helpful for all of us who are either working directly to support children to become skilled readers, intervening with struggling readers, or those of us who are supporting the people who are on the front lines doing the reading instruction and intervention. So the guide really begins with this very powerful message. And hopefully you got to see Tracy Whedon's presentation. She was instrumental in crafting this preamble. At the end of this session, I'm going to show you the link where you can view her video of her reading this. It's so powerful. This preamble really sets the stage. It speaks to my heart, to my passion about why reading is the absolute most important and essential skill that we need to be equipping all students with. The students have a basic human right to become readers. It is our responsibility as educators to make sure that we are making that happen for students. And it's really what has driven me personally in my career, the understanding that literacy opens doors for students and that we know too much to be getting the low outcomes that we're getting. We need to make sure that every educator is equipped with the knowledge that exists in the reading research, that we're providing structures and materials and ongoing knowledge building so that educators can actualize, can put into practice the knowledge base that's in the reading research. We just absolutely know too much to be getting the low outcomes that we are for students. It's not acceptable. And so this guide is an attempt to change that, to make sure that teachers have what they need to be effective reading instructors. I was part of the group that crafted this defining guide. Pam Kastner joined me in that work. You can see the list of folks from a variety of different backgrounds and professions who were part of crafting this definition. We really want it to be something that represents a wide variety of educators so that it can be used by everyone. So I am biased in really believing in the information that's included in this guide. So I want to just start with the definition itself. The definition is on the screen and highlight a couple of components of this definition that I think are really worth unpacking. So the science of reading has maybe become sort of a buzzword, right? Like it's a phrase that is being used more and more in the last 10 years. And it's important that we all have clarity and an understanding of what we mean when we say the science of reading, that we're all speaking to it from the same definition. So the idea behind the defining guide is to give everyone a common definition. It becomes your definition. You can use it in your presentations. You can use it in your discussions in your school. You can use it to guide your own learning. And it really is a definition that allows us to understand that the science of reading is not a thing. It's not this sort of finite group of practices or set of knowledge that is static. It is, in fact, a vast interdisciplinary body of knowledge, a specific type of research. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit more in just a few minutes. But it's not a single study. It's not a certain type of research. It's a vast body of evidence, not just from education, but from other fields, cognitive science, neuroscience, communication sciences, school psychology, and so on. And it is not just about reading, but also issues related to reading, like writing and spelling. And this is not new. The term science of reading might be the new terminology that we're using to describe things that we've been talking about for decades. And the research itself has been around for 50 years, for a long time. And the evidence that we want to be talking about as the science of reading is specifically this phrase, scientifically based research. We're going to talk about what that means in particular. The definition includes how reading and writing develop, why some students might have difficulty in acquiring those skills, how we can effectively assess, so it includes assessment, and teach, and therefore prevent and intervene. So it involves both prevention of reading difficulties and intervention when students are struggling readers. So it's a broad definition, and you're going to see that it is not just about a specific ideology or philosophy. It's not about somebody's opinion. It's not a fad or a trend or a pendulum swing. You'll sometimes hear that criticism. It's definitely not a political agenda. In fact, it's something that can very much unite people across different political persuasions. It is not a one size fits all. It's not about a program. That's a trap that I think sometimes people fall into when they first start hearing about the science of reading. They think it is a thing that they can go and buy, like it's a boxed program that they can purchase. It's not a single specific component like phonics. So hopefully that helps to dispel some of the misunderstandings. And that's really the goal of having a common definition. Now that this phrase, the science of reading, is being bantered about in our professional conversations, it's really important that we're all clear on what the science of reading is, that we're all talking about it in the same way, that we have this common definition. So that was the goal in creating this defining guide. We want teachers in their conversations within their schools to have the same definition that they're talking from when they're making choices about instructional practices, when they're talking to parents about why they're choosing to teach reading in a particular way. We want school administrators to have a definition that can guide and structure the practices that they're supporting in their schools, the choices of professional learning that they're providing, and the purchasing of materials in their district. We want all of us who have a stake in reading outcomes to be speaking about the science of reading from the same perspective, to have the same definition. This will also help us, I think, to protect this body of evidence, to protect the science of reading from misunderstandings, from criticisms, from attacks, frankly, so that we can continue to collect the body of evidence that's constantly evolving and growing so that we can serve our students in the best possible ways. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on a particular section of the defining guide that unpacks this term scientifically based research. So there are lots of different types of research that you might encounter, and different types of research methods that are used to explore reading. In the defining guide, we decided to focus specifically on the kind of research that answers questions that would help teachers know how to make choices to do A or B in the classroom, right? So that very practical level of, should I do X or should I do Y? Am I more likely to get a result if I do A or B? So to be able to make those kinds of conclusions that one instructional approach is more effective than another, you need a specific type of research. And that research design would be experimental. It would be what we call quantitative, experimental, or quasi-experimental studies. So these are studies that specifically have included a practice or an approach to instruction or an intervention where some students are given that new approach or different approach, and other students are not. So we have what's called a control group. Some students who are getting this treatment or this instructional approach, some students who are not getting it, where we have reliable and valid assessments that are used to measure student outcomes. And we can really quantify what the procedures of that approach or intervention were so that they could be replicated by other people. It's very specifically defined what the instruction was that the students in the experimental group got and the students in the control group did not get. so that we can draw conclusions afterwards about the effectiveness of one approach over another. So this is a very specific type of research that you're going to see published in what's called a peer-reviewed journal, a journal publication by a professional association or group that has gone through a review of a group of folks who are familiar with the subject matter or familiar with the research methods that was used. So it's kind of a quality control check. If it gets published in a peer-reviewed journal, you can be sure that some experts have looked over the aspects of the study and the conclusions that were drawn, and they have some merit. They've passed that sort of quality control check. So that's what you want to be looking for in terms of the science of reading. Now, that doesn't mean that we're excluding other types of research from having value. So there are qualitative studies, there are research methods that are more observational in nature. They can be helpful, especially in the beginning stages of investigating new approaches to reading instruction or intervention, investigating new questions that we might have about students, and helping us to move towards conducting experimental studies. So it's not that we're excluding those types of research methods, it's just that we are not including them in the definition of the science of reading, because we're specifically worried about and concerned about communicating when we have research that shows that A works better than B, right? That practical in the classroom piece of information that we need. So just to go outside of the defining guide just a little bit to fill in some additional background information, if you will, I want to set the stage for the kind of publication where you will see this type of scientifically based research or the experimental and quasi-experimental studies. They'll be published in research articles that we can think of as primary literature, where the authors of the research study themselves are writing up the summary of what they did. This is a different kind of publication from some others that you're probably familiar with. So blogs might cite research, but they are not the actual research. You will come across opinion pieces or descriptive summaries of research. Those can be very, very helpful. Sometimes those research summaries are in books. I'm thinking about, for example, Mark Seidenberg's book, Language at the Speed of Sight. He has certainly conducted a lot of research himself, but that book is more of a summary or a compilation of a lot of different research studies. There are sometimes published literature reviews, again, that try to give you a picture across a variety of summaries. And there's a specific type of statistical process called a meta-analysis that tries to summarize the results of a variety of research studies. I'm not talking about any of those kinds of publications. I'm talking about directing our focus to the primary literature that is a summary, a research article in a peer-reviewed journal that summarizes a specific research study. And those studies are published in journals in a fairly standard way. So you'll sort of know that you're looking at that type of publication when you see the components that I've listed here. When you see an abstract that summarizes the research study, when there's a literature review that sort of summarizes the research that led to the specific research question that's being studied in this particular project. You'll see a description of the methods. Who were the students? What kinds of schools were they in? What were the procedures that were used in the research project? You'll see the research design and methods described. And then you'll see the results. That's typically where you'll see tables and graphs, different depictions of the results of that experimental versus control group. And then you'll see the authors discuss the limitations from their perspective. And hopefully you'll see a discussion at the end of how the research can be helpful to classroom teachers, to people working in schools. How do we translate this into our work with students? And all of that will be published in a journal that has an editorial board where there is a process for researchers to submit their work for publication, and there's a peer review process. So it's passed that quality control check. So that's specifically the kind of research that we want to really be relying on for informing the work that we're doing in schools. As I said, this kind of research is always evolving. We know what we know today, but the more we know, the more questions we have, and that sparks additional research to happen in the future. We'll continue to refine our understanding of issues related to reading. So you can find these kinds of research studies published in professional journals. You can find them summarized in certain documents like the IES guides. You can see this kind of research highlighted in the professional development and book studies that are offered by Patent. You can get access to these journals through certain professional association memberships. If you're a member of the International Dyslexia Association, for example, or the Reading League, you can get access to their journals. And if you don't have access otherwise, you can phone a friend. You can find somebody who has access to databases where you can search up information on a variety of topics related to reading. You want to make sure that the research you're reviewing has some of the quality indicators. I've mentioned some of these already, but these are the things that I think most people would agree to serve as indicators that the research was conducted in a quality way. And this means that you can have more confidence in the findings, that it was conducted in a way that could be replicated, that really demonstrates control over the variables that were being studied, and that you can generalize the results to the students that you are working with. So back into the actual defining guide itself. I want to unpack some of the elements and some of the components that are within the pages of this guide. And again, you can purchase for yourself your own copy. You can purchase it for your staff, or you can download the PDF version at no cost from the very same website. And I'm going to give you that website URL at the end of the presentation. So you're going to see brief treatment of some really important research findings, because the guide has to be accessible, it can't be too long. But one of the things that you're going to see illustrated, for example, like you see this image of the brain, is the fact that we know so much now about the way that our brains need to be networked. Sections of our brain that were perhaps originally evolved for other purposes, like language and memory and vision, have to get rewired in a way to become a reading brain. And I think for me, one of the most significant findings of the reading research is that reading is not natural. We are not born with this network of connections in our brain. It's something that has to be created through experience, through instruction. It happens in a way for some students that sort of seems natural because it seems to come more easily to some students. Other students are going to need much more deliberate and intentional instruction to create that reading network. But it's something that needs to be built, and we can do that through our instruction. So this is different from what some of us were taught in our teacher preparation programs, that reading is sort of natural if we create the right environment for students, if we wait until a student is quote unquote ready. There's some kind of maturational point that we should wait for, and then the student will on their own acquire reading. We know reading doesn't work in that way. It's not like language or walking, doesn't operate that way in terms of the structure of our brain. So I think that's a really important finding. There's probably a lot we could talk about related to that. There's also the very deliberate depiction of the simple view of reading within the defining guide, this theoretical model that helps guide our instruction, our assessment, our intervention, our knowledge of the way we create reading comprehension. So this is originally a theory that has now been documented as being accurate through lots and lots of different studies. The fact that reading comprehension is the product of word recognition and language comprehension. These two broad capacities that students have to have in order for reading comprehension to be in place. So it's depicted as a math problem to communicate that if students have diminished capacities in either word recognition or language comprehension, their reading comprehension will be compromised. And you can't make up for a lack of language comprehension by having really excellent word recognition skills. It doesn't work like that. You have to have competency in both of those broad domains. It also communicates that what it takes for reading comprehension to happen can really be distilled into these two areas. Now, there's complexity within each of these areas, but the two areas pretty much explain what it takes to have reading comprehension. So this theoretical model helps frame the way that we teach reading from the beginning. It has to include a prioritization of word recognition and language comprehension. And this model also helps us when we're faced with students who are struggling readers to explain why they're not understanding what they're reading. We can look to word recognition and language comprehension to help with that. So within the defining guide, we took a sample, and you'll notice it says specifically here, a sampling of instructional practices. Again, the guide was meant to be brief. So a sampling of some of the research findings in these two areas, word recognition and language comprehension. And we're contrasting what we know in the research on the left-hand side of the screen with what we know not to be the case on the right-hand side. So for example, we know that phonemic awareness and letter recognition, letter knowledge are essential skills. We know that students absolutely must acquire the ability to effortlessly connect phonemes to graphemes. And we know that the explicit instruction in word recognition, in phonics and decoding, is something that has to be a part of every student's primary grade reading instruction. And that those skills also have to be practiced in the context of real reading and writing activities. So practiced in decodable text, practiced in other types of text, and practiced in terms of spelling as well as reading. On the right-hand side, you're going to see some things that are not supported by the research. So again, just meant to be a sample. Spending lots of time on larger linguistic units, not getting to the phoneme or delaying getting to instruction on the phoneme, or teaching those skills like letter sound or phonemic awareness in kind of an incidental way, teaching it as a reaction to the errors that students make instead of front loading those phonics and decoding skills. In the area of language comprehension, we don't have quite as much research. These skills are not quite as straightforward. These underlying cognitive and linguistic structures are a little bit more difficult to measure. And so the research is not quite as elaborate as it is in terms of word recognition, but there's still quite a bit that we know, and we should be putting what we know into practice in classrooms. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a sampling of some of the instructional practices related to language comprehension that we should really be implementing in schools. So reading aloud from a variety of types of complex text, that's something that should be just an absolute aspect of instruction across the board, really, and across grade levels, so that we are encouraging students to engage with text that's even more difficult than what they could read on their own. That's an excellent way for students to learn about text structure, for them to get access to content knowledge, for them to learn new vocabulary words, to learn about syntax and morphology. So really making good use of that read aloud time. And then also, in addition to that, making sure that we are explicitly teaching some of those underlying language structures like syntax and grammar and morphology and vocabulary. On the right-hand side of this image, you'll see some practices that do not have research support. So for example, reading aloud from a leveled text that students are going to be reading in their small group. That's not going to give the level of language complexity that we need students to have access to. Or just not explicitly teaching these skills or teaching them as a result of errors that students make. Not teaching language comprehension explicitly or not giving enough time to directly teaching those skills. We wanted to make sure that the Science of Reading Defining Guide represented all students. And we especially wanted to elevate the fact that students who have linguistic differences, students who perhaps are English language learners, that the research that is contained in the Science of Reading speaks to the instruction we should be providing to those students as well. That we definitely need to be supporting their word recognition skills. Again, that's a little bit more straightforward, even with English learners. But at the same time, we also need to be supporting their oral language competencies, their competence in spoken English. And that we can't wait until their word recognition skills are brought up to grade level to do that. We need to do it in tandem from the get-go, really. We also wanted to make sure that we were elevating and bringing forward the fact that the Science of Reading is not a menu of practices. It's not about swapping out one program for another. It's not about just making a change to your instructional practices. It may involve those things, but decisions about what's going to change within your school or what needs to change to get better reading outcomes really needs to be made within the context of a school-wide literacy model. So multi-tiered systems of support is the research-based model for implementing and delivering the instructional practices and knowledge that are within the Science of Reading, so that we're not just, listening to what another district is doing or seeing, flashy marketing about a particular product or program and just swapping out what we've been doing for these new things that are labeled Science of Reading. We want to make sure that schools have good assessment practices in place that allow them to get very clear about the needs of their students, and then that schools have teams that are using a structured problem-solving process, a database decision-making process to identify the needs of their students and create instructional systems that are aligned to the student needs. And that effort is primarily focused on the way we teach reading the first time in classroom reading instruction, that we are making sure that our curriculum and instruction in core reading or tier 1 is matched to the needs of the students in our school, and that we have the systems and structures in place that will allow us to intensify the instructional support to become more explicit and more supportive when we have data that suggests that students need more support to meet our reading expectations. So that's what the MTSS model is designed to do. And it really needs to become the delivery framework for implementing the Science of Reading. So we wanted to make sure that that was communicated within the defining guide. So there, at the back of the defining guide, you're going to see a series of calls to action. So I just want to highlight a couple of these, and I want you to be looking for yourself in these. So whatever role you're in, I want you to listen to all of them, but really have your ears perk up when it is speaking to the role that you serve in education. So we want for all of you to learn about the Science of Reading. This is perhaps a challenging task for some of us who have those firmly held beliefs, who've got a lot of experience with other ways of teaching. This is going to cause us to need to have an open mind to make sure that what we are focused on is the outcomes for our students. This is not change for change's sake. This is about getting better outcomes for our students. We call on district and school administrators, school boards, school committees to make sure that the policies and procedures that they're putting in place are aligned to the reading research, that the professional development that administrators are designing and delivering and providing is aligned to the reading research, and the materials and the curriculum that they're providing are aligned to the reading research. We call on state departments of education to make sure that their professional learning opportunities are aligned to the reading research, to make sure that they are supporting in pre-service training, in licensure, in recertification processes for folks to be using what we know in the reading research. We call on policymakers to make sure that they are driving change towards better reading outcomes for all students. We want our professional associations to be aligning their standards and their offerings to the reading research. We want to make sure that we are in a two-way conversation with reading scientists, the folks who are doing that basic research or applied research, that they understand what educators need that will help inform their work, and that they're sharing their research in a way that helps educators understand it and apply it in classrooms. We want to make sure that parents are informed about reading research. We've got lots of wonderful advocacy groups now that are helping to make that happen. We call on schools of education to align their coursework, their field experiences to the reading research. We want pediatricians and other folks who are healthcare providers to know about reading, the way that it develops, to know about the warning signs of when there's difficulty, perhaps with reading and writing, so that they can help families be better informed and identify any potential problems with reading as early as possible. We call on curriculum developers and publishers to not just slap a label on their products that says the science of reading, to really do the work that they need to do to understand what's in the reading research, and then to be brave enough to change their offerings so that they are aligned, to not be driven by profit, to actually be driven by outcomes, and aligning their materials to the reading research is a big step forward in that way. We want federal agencies and private foundations to make sure that their PD is aligned to what we know from the reading research, and that what they offer to the public is aligned as well. Also, towards the end of the defining guide is something that takes a little bit of a different turn, right? So this is some guidance that comes from work that Nathan Clemens has done to invite us all to become good members of a scientific community. So Dr. Clemens is a researcher, and he wants us all now as educators to be thinking of ourselves as part of a scientific community. And that comes with some benefits and some responsibilities, right? So I think this guidance is really, really important. This is a part of the defining guide that I find myself rereading and revisiting and thinking about in terms of my daily actions, my behaviors. So when we are taking on new practices and new learning, moving towards the science of reading, it might challenge our past beliefs. It might challenge or even threaten the investments that we've made in the past, what we have sort of staked as our claim in the way that reading happens, maybe claims that we've made publicly, perhaps things that we felt very confident about that were informing our work. And maybe some of those things are called into question. Honestly, they will be called into question. That's part of being part of a scientific community. We are seeking the best possible knowledge and the best way of working with students that's going to get us the outcomes that we absolutely must get for our students. So this causes us to have to be open to the idea that what we know today is possibly going to change, that we have to be open to having our ideas challenged. That's how science evolves and progresses. And we have to be ready and willing to engage in conversation with people that can be challenging. We have to do that in a professional way. We have to put aside our preferences, our beliefs, our sort of folklore, if you will, the urban legends about reading or about how reading should be taught, and be willing to be guided by the evidence, be willing to be focused on the evidence, and to become part of the community that is sharing and communicating what is in the reading research. So I really love this aspect of the defining guide. I find it to be both supportive and challenging, both. So maybe that's why I like it for that contrast. So at the end of the guide, there's a statement. Actually, I'm not sure if this is at the end. This might come earlier with the description of scientifically based research. But it's a quote from this excellent document from Stanovich and Stanovich. And it really gets to the heart of this idea that we can make causal inferences. We can draw conclusions from the reading research. And that's exactly the kind of statement or claim that one approach to teaching reading, one method, one intervention works better than others. That's exactly the kind of information we're trying to glean when we conduct research in reading, because that's the practical information that teachers need every day to help guide the many decisions that they are making. When we have a good understanding of what's in the reading research, we can then go about the important business of implementing that for the benefit of our students. So that's really where we need to get to in translating the research into practice. The guide closes where it began with this idea of an equity statement, with literacy as the defining human right, that regardless of the sort of accidents of your birth, that you will have access to high quality reading instruction, that it is our responsibility as educators to take on learning about the reading research so that we can bring it to bear in our work with students. This is a way of empowering educators. It's a way of uniting us around our common commitment towards literacy as the way to improve children's lives. That's what we got into education to do. And I really see the science of reading as a call to action for each one of us to do exactly what we intended to do. So I'm going to ask you to make a commitment to some next steps. So I would like you to commit at whatever level is appropriate for you to learning more about the science of reading. I definitely want you to download the defining guide. I want you to get to know it, know what's in it. I want you to take it on as your own definition of the science of reading. Use it in your presentations, use it in your conversations in your school, share it, promote it within your educational settings. Make sure that it is accessible to all educators. I want you to commit to an action this week, right? So I want you to take this information and think about what's the right next step for you, given your role, your current situation. Maybe that's just to reflect on your instruction. Maybe even something that I've said or shared in this presentation is challenging because it's in conflict with what you are currently doing in terms of reading instruction. I want you to reflect on that. Certainly feel free to reach out to me or the folks at Patton to explore that if that's the case. I want you to be critical in a professional way of your instructional materials. Maybe you want to do a review of the materials that you're currently using for their alignment to the reading research. I want you to have conversations with your coworkers. This is sort of an easy next step that we can all take. Have conversations that are supportive of each other, that are exploring perhaps ways that your instruction can be changed so that it's more effective in your setting. Perhaps it would be appropriate for you to contact or write a college or university that you're associated with, maybe a place where you received a degree, or maybe the college or university that sends student teachers into your district, or that's just physically located near you. Engage your local universities in conversation about the science of reading. Take them a copy of the defining guide. Ask them to engage in a conversation with you about the contents of the defining guide. Perhaps invite them to participate in a book study with your school. Ask them to have a conversation with you about something that you're both reading, right? So get engaged so that we can make sure that pre-service component is part of this change towards the science of reading. And perhaps it would be appropriate for you to contact your elected officials. Maybe you have legislation in your state related to reading or related to education, and you could be a source of good information to make sure that your elected officials know about the defining guide and they're using it in their work. So before we move on, I want you to just think of how you're going to take a next step. Make a commitment to doing one of these. Okay, so to start to wrap us up, I'm going to share some resources. First and foremost, the link to the defining guide. If you Google what is the science of reading, you will get a link to the defining guide. If you go to the Reading League's website, you'll see an opportunity to download or purchase the defining guide. So that's where you're going to find it. As I mentioned, you can go straight to Tracy Whedon's preamble to the defining guide, her reading it on YouTube. That is a powerful video, and it's a really excellent tool to spark conversations and discussion. You can use it in a staff meeting, in a parent meeting, in those conversations with folks in higher ed or elected officials. Stanislaus Dehaene has an excellent video also online that will go into the how the brain learns to read. So what's going on to create that reading network in brains. And because I was so intrigued by this idea of a scientific community, it's something that I've written about. So I mentioned I've thought a lot about it. I've written about it. Hopefully that blog post would be supportive of you and encouraging of you as you become and engage as a member of a scientific community. So I'm including my contact information here. We will have some time for Q&A, and we've got quite a bit of time actually for Q&A, so that's good. But if there's something that we don't get to in the Q&A or something that you just want to ask me privately, feel free to reach out by email.